Moments in history that have deeply impressed us and made us think, because they show us how differently the paths of humanity can unfold. While Europe boldly sailed beyond the Mediterranean, discovered new continents, and ushered in the age of discovery, there existed in the East an empire that had already produced many inventions without which our world today would be unimaginable. Just think of paper, printing, the compass, and gunpowder. Yet, instead of conquering the world, it often turned its gaze inward, proud of its own significance, firmly convinced that it was the center of civilization. Here a fascinating paradox emerges. China, one of the oldest cultures, sees itself as the Middle Kingdom. Yet the idea of a modern nation is surprisingly young. How did it happen that a civilization that had influenced our thinking and actions for thousands of years only began, in the late 19th century, to define itself as a nation in the European sense? Perhaps this is one of the most exciting stories of our time. A journey that moves between ancient myths and modern identities, forgotten inventions and global influences. In the coming chapters, we will take this journey and discover how the ancient empire of China became the young nation of the Han Chinese. Chapter 1. The Four Great Inventions and Their Effects. When we think of China's cultural treasures, images of porcelain, silk, and tea immediately appear before our inner eye. Yet, the true greatness of this civilization reveals itself in the four discoveries that permanently influenced the fate of the world. Paper, printing, the compass, and gunpowder are not only technical masterpieces, but also the foundations of a new order that directed science, trade, religion, and power onto completely new paths. Each of these advances was like a stone thrown into water, with waves reaching far beyond the Middle Kingdom. The first foundations was paper. Around 105 AD, Kai Lun, during the Eastern Han Dynasty, developed a method of processing fibers from hemp, rags, tree bark, and other materials into a fine, durable surface. While Europe still depended for centuries on costly parchment made from animal skins, texts, administrative documents, and poems could be distributed in large numbers in China. Paper was more than just a material. It was a cultural revolution. Knowledge could be preserved more easily. Ideas could circulate faster, and education now reached social classes that had previously been excluded. When the secret of papermaking spread westward along the Silk Road, it changed not only the Islamic world, but eventually also Christian Europe, where it created the basis for the later leaps of knowledge during the Renaissance. Yet, without printing, paper would have remained powerless. Long before Gutenberg invented movable type in Mainz, the Chinese had already mastered woodblock printing from the 19th century onward, and later also the casting of metal characters. This technique in China was often intended only for religious texts and imperial decrees, but its potential was enormous. In Europe, printing in the 15th century led to the Reformation, the spread of new ideas, and a cultural upheaval that would hardly have been imaginable without the earlier model from the East. It is fascinating to see how the same concept was interpreted in completely different ways in different cultures. While in China the focus was on preserving what already existed, in Europe questioning authorities became central. The compass also had an important role to play. As early as ancient China, scholars experimented with magnetized needles that floated on water and indicated direction. By the medieval period, the device took a form that was already quite similar to the modern compass. This made reliable orientation possible even in fog or on the open sea. In China, the compass was not used only in seafaring. Here, the difference becomes visible once again. While China possessed the technology, Europe used it decisively for expansion and colonization. One of the most contradictory inventions was perhaps gunpowder. Originally developed in the 9th century by alchemists who were searching for the elixir of immortality, it soon unfolded a devastating power. In China, it was first used for fireworks and ritual purposes, later also for military purposes. Europe, on the other hand, quickly recognized its military potential, and in the late Middle Ages canons revolutionized the architecture of castles, while gunpowder ushered in a new era of warfare. The East gave the world a substance that, in the dreams of Taoists, awakened the hope of immortality. Yet the West transformed it into a tool of destruction and power. What connects all four of these inventions is not only their technical value, but also the way societies dealt with them. In China, they were often used to strengthen internal order, while Europe regarded them as means for expansion and for reshaping the world. Here lies one of the keys to understanding the historical differences between East and West. And this raises a new question. If these discoveries existed so early in China, why did the Middle Kingdom remain trapped in its own cosmos? To understand this, we must dive deeper into symbolism and examine its self-image as the center of civilization. That is exactly where the next chapter takes us. Chapter 2: Porcelain and Silk. The cultural treasures of China. When one thinks of China, three symbols inevitably appear before the inner eye: noble porcelain, mysterious silk, and aromatic tea. These three goods are far more than mere trade products. They embody a way of life. They tell of craftsmanship, of the observation of nature, and of the longing for beauty and harmony. Their journey from the workshops and fields of China to the palaces of Europe reflects global interconnections long before the term globalization was ever coined. Porcelain, often described as white gold, developed during the Tang dynasty and reached its highest perfection in the Ming period. The combination of kaolin and feldspar, fired at high temperatures, created a ceramic art of such fineness and hardness that even kings and popes were amazed. The blue patterns on a white background became especially famous, emerging under the influence of cobalt from Persia. When the Dutch East India Company brought large quantities to Europe in the 17th century, the import led to a true wave of enthusiasm. In Delft, people began producing imitations, while in England bone china was developed. Yet, none of these variants could ever surpass the grace of the original. Porcelains embodied elegance, cosmopolitan refinement, and the claim to be part of a highly developed culture. Equally fascinating was silk, whose secrets were carefully guarded for centuries. As early as the 3rd millennium BC, Chinese weavers created fabrics from the delicate threads of the silkworm that were so shimmering and light that they seemed like liquid light. Through the Silk Road, they found their way to Central Asia, the Near East, and finally, to Rome, where senators and merchants alike were willing to invest a fortune in a single garment. In the Roman Empire, enthusiasm for silk even sparked moral debates because people feared that such luxury could weaken society. Nevertheless, silk remained extremely desired. For China, it was not only a trade good, but also a diplomatic instrument used to forge alliances and gain recognition. Only centuries later, When the secret of sericulture became known in the Byzantine Empire, did China lose its monopoly? Yet the shine of silk remained unbroken. Finally, tea, the most modest of the three treasures, developed into a global cultural good. Already during the Han period, it was valued as a medicinal plant and later cultivated as an everyday drink. During the Tang dynasty, a true tea culture emerged, with rituals, poems, and artfully crafted bowls. In the 17th century, tea reached Europe through Portuguese and Dutch traders, and quickly became a favorite of the English aristocracy. From there it conquered the world, shaped trade routes, and was not rarely the cause of political conflicts, as the famous Boston Tea Party in the 18th century impressively shows. For China, tea was far more than a beverage. It embodied purity, calmness, and a deep connection to nature. In every cup, a philosophy was reflected that embodied the striving for harmony between human beings and the environment. Porcelain, silk, and tea make clear that China exercised its influence not only through weapons or conquests, but above all through cultural radiance. These products united masterful craftsmanship with deep symbolic meaning and became ambassadors of a civilization conscious of its own aesthetics. Compared with Europe, where raw materials or metals often symbolized wealth, China emphasized artistry and a refined way of life. This reflects a different understanding of the world, one that values beauty and harmony more highly than mere power. Yet, as impressive as these cultural goods are, they lead us to an even deeper question. How did the Chinese see themselves in this rich world? How did they understand their role in the global community? The next chapter begins here, with the idea of the Middle Kingdom, which has shaped China's self-image since antiquity and still echoes today. Chapter 3. Names and Self-Understanding from Qin to Zhongguo. Names are far more than simple designations. They are a mirror of self-understanding and a window into the soul of a culture. When we speak of China today, we use a word whose origin lies outside the country. The origin of the name China can probably be traced back to the Qin dynasty, which unified the empire in the 3rd century BC under Emperor Qin Shi Huang. The term found its way through Sanskrit to India, and from there reached the Western world through traders and sailors. Portuguese and Malay intermediaries contributed to its spread, so that the name became firmly anchored in European usage. The fact that a people is named from the outside already reveals much about the early distance between East and West. Yet the people within their own empire referred to their homeland quite differently. Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom. As early as the 1st millennium BC, this term symbolized the center of the world, the fertile central plain along the Huanghe, where culture, writing, and systems of government had their origins. Zhongguo was more than just a geographical term. It was a concept that emphasized one's own superiority and cultural radiance. While Greeks and Romans defined barbarians as those beyond their borders, the Chinese saw themselves as the heart of civilization, surrounded by peripheral regions of lesser culture. It is remarkable that self-designation always remained flexible. People often named their country after the ruling dynasty, whether Qin, Han, Tang, or Ming. Each of these names represented an era, a cultural and political high point. It is therefore no coincidence that the largest population group is still known today as Han. It is a legacy of that dynasty, which was not only militarily successful, but also created an administration and a cultural identity that continue to have an effect to this day. Yet, Han does not mean that all Chinese people can simply be equated with it. China officially recognizes 56 ethnic groups, with the Han making up more than 9/10 of the population. In German, and often in English, we speak generally of the Chinese, but in the Chinese language there are clear distinctions. Zhongguoren refers to citizens of the state, while Hanren refers to members of the majority culture. This distinction is crucial for understanding the complexity of Chinese identity. A Tibetan or a Uyghur can be called Zhongguoren, but not Hanren. Different names also emerged outside the empire. Marco Polo spoke of Cathay, derived from the Khitan people, who founded the Liao dynasty in the 10th century. This name still lives on in Russia, where China is known as Kitai. This shows that different neighbors had different perspectives, depending on which dynasty they encountered. For the steppe peoples in the north, China was the land of the Khitan. For Arab traders, it was the land of Al-Sin, and for Europeans later, it was simply China. This diversity of names is no coincidence, but reflects an empire that was repeatedly contacted, attacked, or influenced by foreigners, without ever giving up its own self-image. While the outside world pressed it into categories, the empire preserved its idea of the center, Zhongguo, whose emperor ruled under the mandate of heaven. In this tension between outside designation and self-understanding lies a key to understanding Chinese history. Comparisons with Europe are revealing here. While nation-states with clear borders and names such as France, England, and Spain emerged in the West, the Chinese self-image remained strongly cosmological. It was less about geographical lines and more about cultural hierarchies. The empire represented the center, while everything else was viewed as peripheral zones that, depending on their position, were classified either as civilization or as barbarism. This viewpoint, however, had consequences, because whoever sees himself as the center loses interest in things outside, in what is foreign. This idea now leads us to a decisive chapter: the concept of the Middle Kingdom, a worldview that shaped China's politics and culture for thousands of years and continues to exist in subtle form today. Chapter 4. Language and sound from Guanhua to Putonghua. Language is far more than just a tool for communication. It is the heartbeat of a culture, the sound of its identity. In China, this is especially pronounced because a common script has connected people for centuries whose, in daily life, use very different sounds. When traveling through the provinces, one encounters a fascinating diversity. Melodic Cantonese in Guangdong, the soft sounds of Wu around Shanghai, the old Min languages in Fujian, and the distinctive tones of Hakka. Each of these language varieties is like its own sound tapestry woven into regional history and tradition. Yet above all these dialects and language varieties, there hovers a unified roof, a language that became the voice of the empire, Guanhua, the language of imperial officials. Already, during the Ming and Qing dynasties, Guanhua served imperial officials so that they could communicate across the immeasurable empire. It was a compromise that arose from northern dialects, especially from the area around Beijing. This language, however, was not intended for the everyday life of farmers, but for administration, diplomacy, and the court. Incidentally, the term Mandarin does not come from China itself, but was shaped by Portuguese sailors in the 16th century, who used the word Mandarim for high officials. Thus a term became established in the West, that still refers to the standard variety of Chinese today. Mandarin, as we know it today, developed over centuries. Only in the 20th century, after the fall of the empire, did people begin systematically to establish a common national language. It was called Putonghua, the common speech. It is based on northern pronunciation, but uses unified grammar and standardized vocabulary. In schools, universities, and the media, it became the norm in order to simplify communication in a country with hundreds of millions of people. What is fascinating about this language is the balance between simplicity and complexity. On the one hand, it includes only about 400 basic syllables. On the other hand, each of these syllables is differentiated by tones, which can significantly change the meaning. A well-known example is the syllable ma. In the first tone, it can mean mother, in the second hemp, in the third horse, and in the fourth to scold. To European ears, this may sound playful at first, almost like music's, but it requires immense precision in speaking. Mistakes in tone can lead to misunderstandings, and exactly here it becomes clear how closely sound and meaning are interwoven in Chinese. In comparison, the German language, with its clear consonants and compound words, seems almost factual, while Chinese plays with melody and rhythm. Nevertheless, there is one similarity. Over the centuries, Standard German developed into a common, written, and standard language, similar to how Putonghua became established in China as a standard, without completely displacing regional dialects. In Bavaria or Saxony, German may sound different, but the standard language is understood by all. This is reflected in China's situation with Putonghua. This balance between unity and diversity still shapes Chinese identity today. On the one hand, there is pride in the common written language, which has shown remarkable continuity for more than 3,000 years. On the other hand, the diversity of regional idioms continues to flourish, carried by families, songs, and local traditions. Anyone who thinks Chinese is a single uniform language overlooks the rich polyphony contained within it. It is precisely in this linguistic diversity that the empire's self-understanding also becomes visible, a center that promotes unity without completely eliminating differences. This attitude between integration and separation explains why China understood itself for centuries as the Middle Kingdom. In the next chapter, we will therefore deal more intensively with this idea, this worldview that profoundly shaped the country's politics and culture. Chapter 5. The Middle Kingdom. Worldview and Geopolitics. Let us imagine a map of the ancient world. In the West, the Greeks looked toward the Mediterranean, which they regarded as the cradle of their culture, and sailed out to found colonies. Rome expanded this view by creating an empire from the Atlantic to the Near East. In all these ideas, the world was in motion, open to trade, exchange, and conquest. Things were very different in the East. China had long seen itself not simply as one power among many, but as the center of civilization, Zheng, the Middle Kingdom. This self-understanding has deep historical roots. Already during the Zhou dynasty, between the 11th and 3rd centuries BC, a model emerged that imagined the empire in concentric zones. At the center resided the ruler, the son of heavens, surrounded by vassal states, and finally by border regions, regarded as less cultivated. This idea was not merely theoretical, but influenced concrete political measures. Whoever paid homage to the emperor and offered tribute was recognized as part of the order. Whoever refused was considered barbaric, regardless of how advanced their own culture might have been. The concept of the mandate of heaven strengthened this view. Rule was not only a matter of power, but also of divine legitimacy. As long as the emperor ruled justly, the mandate remained in place. In the case of natural disasters or uprisings, this was interpreted as a sign that heaven had withdrawn its favor. For geopolitical order, this meant that China did not have to compete with other states on equal footing, but understood itself as the center whose legitimacy was cosmically grounded. This worldview had far-reaching consequences. While Europe in the late Middle Ages and early modern period was shaped by power struggles, alliances, and shifting balances, China viewed the world less as competition and more as a hierarchical structure. Diplomacy did not mean conducting negotiations between equals, but recognizing Chinese primacy. Tribute missions from Korea, Vietnam, and Central Asian envoys are striking examples of this system. For the Chinese, it was self-evident that the emperor accepted gifts and in return also presented gifts. This was not trade in the Western sense, but a confirmation of the cosmic order. It is especially fascinating how this thinking also influenced geopolitical relations. The impressive fleets of Admiral Zheng in the early 15th century show that China certainly had the technical possibilities to rise as a sea power. Yet, when threats increased on the northern borders through the Mongols, the court decided to invest resources instead in land defense. The sea was regarded as a peripheral zone, inhabited by foreigners and barbarians who did not need to be conquered as long as they recognized imperial authority. In contrast, Europeans used the same compass and ships to establish a global network of colonies and trading posts. This field of tension between inner strength and outward separation shaped China's history for centuries. The Middle Kingdom was not merely a geographical place, but rather a mental attitude. It was less about conquering the world and much more about preserving one's own center. Yet the world did not stop. When, in the 19th century, the European powers increasingly pushed into Asia, the Chinese worldview reached its limits. The idea of being the sole center collided with the reality of equal nation-states. Here began a conflict that shook the empire's self-understanding and forced it to find new paths. Before we examine these upheavals in detail, however, it is worthwhile to look at the cultural expressions that emerged from this attitude, especially in seafaring and the expeditions that ended so abruptly. In the next chapter, we therefore turn our attention to the legendary voyages of Admiral Zheng He, which seem like a brief glimpse into an alternative history. What would have happened if China had not closed its Middle Kingdom, but opened itself to the world? Chapter 6. Zheng He and the Forgotten Fleets. In history, there are moments that seem like doors to an alternative reality. One of these moments bears the name Zheng He. He was not an emperor and not a philosopher, but an extraordinary admiral who traveled the seas in the early 15th century and, for a short time, led China to dominance over the oceans. Between 1405 and 1433, he led 7 great expeditions that carried the Middle Kingdom from the coasts of Southeast Asia to India, Arabia, and East Africa. The scale of these enterprises exceeds all imagination. Contemporary reports speak of ships that were said to have been more than 100 meters long. These were the so-called treasure ships, equipped with several masts and gigantic sails. Even if modern historians qualify some of these figures, it is certain that Zheng He's fleets were enormous. Hundreds of ships were accompanied by tens of thousands of sailors, soldiers, craftsmen, and diplomats. They transported silk, porcelain, and tea, but also gifts for foreign rulers, who in return offered tribute. These voyages were more than mere adventures. They pursued a political goal: the confirmation of imperial power and the expansion of Chinese influence across the Indian Ocean. In cities such as Calicut and Hormuz, in Mogadishu, and along the coast of Malindi, Chinese envoys appeared, established contacts, exchanged goods, and brought exotic animals, including giraffes, back to Nanjing. These encounters demonstrated the strength of the Middle Kingdom to the world and conveyed the image of a global order in which the emperor stood at the center. In comparison with European sea voyages, the difference quickly becomes clear. While the voyages of Vasco da Gama or Christopher Columbus were motivated by economic pressure and colonial ambition, Zheng He's enterprises had primarily a representative character. The goal was to demonstrate, not to conquer; to secure tribute, not to annex territories. That was both their strength and their weakness. While Europeans began to establish permanent trading bases and routes, China withdrew again after a few decades. But why was this maritime golden age ended so abruptly? The reasons are varied. On the one hand, there were new threats in the north from Hmong tribes, which forced the imperial court to direct resources toward the military along the land border. On the other hand, conservative officials at court viewed the expeditions as an unnecessary waste of money and argued the empire already produces everything necessary itself and is not dependent on foreign goods. Ideological aspects also played a role. In a world where China understood itself as the center, it seemed of little use to cross vast oceans just to ask barbarians at the edge for tribute. Thus it happened that, after Zheng He's death, the ships rotted in the harbors, maps disappeared into archives, and the memory of these voyages gradually faded. Centuries later, when the Portuguese and Dutch dominated the Indian Ocean, nothing remained of China's former sea power. One could say that China had opened a crack into the world, only to close it again immediately. For historians and history enthusiasts, the question remains: what would have happened if China, with its resources and technology, had come before the Europeans? Would we perhaps have had Chinese colonies in Africa or America? We do not know. Yet the thought alone shows how fateful the emperor's decision was. The story of Zheng He teaches us that power lies not only in the ability to create something new, but also in the will to use it. China possessed the means, yet chose withdrawal. This contrast leads us to this next chapter, in which we examine how isolation and opening, in their interaction, determined the fate of the empire and shaped its role in the world for centuries. Chapter 7. Isolation or Opening. China's Zigzag Course. The history of China resembles a pendulum that swung back and forth for centuries between opening and separation. At times, the empire actively sought exchange with the world. At other times, it closed its gates and relied solely on its own strength. This constant back and forth, this zigzag course, shaped not only politics, but also the self-understanding of the people. After the great expeditions of Admiral Zheng He in the early 15th century, China would have had the chance to become a leading sea power. Yet instead, the imperial court decided to withdraw. The once magnificent ships decayed, and the country once again turned its gaze inward. The belief that the empire was capable of producing all important goods by itself became dominant. Silk and porcelain were desired by the world, while China showed little interest in foreign influences. This self-sufficiency was, on the one hand, an expression of pride, but on the other hand, it also carried risks. While Europe founded colonies and controlled global trade routes, China let the opportunity pass to strengthen its position beyond its own borders. The attitude of separation, however, was not always constant. Already in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Song dynasty had developed an impressive maritime tradition. Traders from southern China sailed as far as Southeast Asia, and in the lively harbors of Guangzhou and Quanzhou, international trade flourished. At the same time, the northern land border repeatedly presented new threats, whether through the Khitan, the Jurchen, or later the Mongols. The empire had to weigh land defense against maritime trade. Again and again, the choice fell in favor of the land, which strengthened the tendency toward isolation. This pattern repeated itself in later centuries as well. Under the Ming dynasty, maritime trade was officially restricted. Private voyages were at times even forbidden. Nevertheless, smuggling flourished, and many Chinese merchants found ways to bring their goods to Southeast Asia or even as far as India. Under the Qing dynasty, controls was strengthened again. In the 18th century, the so-called Canton system was introduced. Foreign traders were allowed to operate only in the harbor of Guangzhou and only under strict supervision, with clear rules about who was allowed to trade, when, and how. For the empire, this was a sign of order. For the Europeans, however, it was a major irritation that they were not willing to accept in the long run. The contrast with Europe could hardly have been greater. While China strove for stability and internal harmony, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and later England pushed their expansion forward with full force. They founded colonies, secured trade monopolies, and created a global order that also reached Asia. When British ships appeared off China's coast in the 19th century, the gap was unmistakable. An empire that saw itself as the center encountered powers that demanded equality and were ready to enforce their claims with violence if necessary. This zigzag movement between openness and isolation explains much of China's later crises. As long as the world was imagined in clear hierarchies, the system of tribute relations functioned. Yet in an age when other nations were building global networks, isolation no longer seemed like strength, but like stagnation. These shifts between closeness and distance, between curiosity and rejection, have shaped Chinese history to this day. They show that cultures do not move toward progress in a straight line, but are influenced by internal tensions and external challenges. And exactly these tensions prepared the ground for a new chapter. How could, in the middle of this diversity and changing attitude, a majority arise that called itself Han? In the following section, we examine the transformation from a multi-ethnic empire to a Han majority, a decisive process that created the foundations of the modern Chinese nation. Chapter 8. From a multi-ethnic empire to the Han majority. China never tells only the story of a single people. From early times, numerous communities existed on its territory, each with its own languages, traditions, and ways of life. From the northern steppe to the tropical regions in the south, a colorful mosaic of cultures emerged, constantly in motion. Yet over the centuries, majority form that we today know as Han. This transition was not sudden, but the result of migration, assimilation, and political integration. The Han dynasty, which ruled from 206 BC to 220 AD, laid the decisive foundations. In this era, a state emerged that united administration, law, and culture in a unity previously unknown. The term Han became a symbol of belonging and stability. Whoever became part of this empire adopted not only its institutions, but also its language, script, and values. The dynasty offered a concept of identity that reached beyond ethnic boundaries. At the same time, the empire remained a multi-ethnic state. In the west lived Tibetan and Turkic-speaking tribes. In the north, nomadic communities such as the Xiongnu, and in the south, peoples with Austroasiatic and other regional roots. Again and again, there were conflicts, defensive struggles, and mutual influences. Some groups were integrated into the empire and merged with the majority culture, while others preserved their independence for centuries. Thus, China was not a homogeneous bloc, but a dynamic interplay of separation and integration. This becomes especially impressive in the Middle Ages. The Tang dynasty, which ruled from the 7th to the 10th century, is considered one of the most cosmopolitan periods of China. In the capital Chang'an lived merchants from Persia, envoys from India, and musicians from Central Asia. This openness meant that Han consciousness was dominant, but was continuously enriched by external influences. At the same time, powerful states existed in the north, such as those of the Khitan and the Jurchen, which at times controlled large parts of northern China. The Yuan dynasty in the 13th century marked a particular turning point. Under Mongol rule, China became part of a huge empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. Many Han felt marginalized during this time, yet precisely this experience paradoxically strengthened their consciousness. When the Ming dynasty drove out the Mongols in the 14th century, the term Han became a firm anchor of identity that endured beyond political systems. In the 17th century, another foreign rule followed with the Manchu. The Qing dynasty, which ruled until the early 20th century and adopted many Chinese values and structures. Nevertheless, many Chinese traditions preserved their own forms. Under Qing rule, the empire experienced significant expansion. Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia became part of the imperial order, bringing even more peoples under Chinese authority. Nevertheless, the Han remained the cultural center. The administrative language, the written characters, and the Confucian educational philosophy were the connecting elements of the empire, even though ethnic differences continued to exist. If one compares this process with Europe, a clear difference becomes visible. While European nations were often shaped by common language and ancestry, the Chinese majority rested on a long tradition of political unity and cultural integration. Being Han was less determined by bloodlines and much more by participation in a shared civilization. Today, the Han make up more than 90% of the population. This ratio is the result of a long history of blending. Many minorities adapted over generations, while others have preserved their cultural characteristics to this day. Chinese identity is therefore not a rigid concept, but a complex web of commonalities and diversity. It is this diversity that moves us forward. If even the heart of the empire absorbed so many influences, then it is worth taking a deeper look at the myths that shaped this identity. Especially important is the legend of the Yellow Emperor, this mythical ancestor who became a symbol of a shared origin. Chapter 9. Myth and Reality. The Yellow Emperor and the Origins. Every culture has its founding figures, those mythical ancestors who weave history and legend together. For China, this is the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, who has been revered for thousands of years as the father of the nation. His figure moves between myth and reality, between legend and possible historical memory. It is said that he lived in the 3rd millennium BC as the leader of a tribe settled along the Yellow River. In ancient chronicles, he is described as a wise ruler, a lawgiver, and an inventor of writing, medicine, and the calendar. Yet these grand attributions reflect less the reality of a single person, and much more the need of a people to anchor its roots in an exalted figure. The meaning of his name is also interesting. Yellow stands not only for a color, but also symbolizes dignity, radiance, and the connection to the earth, the central element in the Chinese cosmos. Thus, Huangdi embodied not only a tribal leader, but the center itself, the link between heaven and humanity. In a world that spoke of the mandate of heaven, he was the first to embody this order. Yet beyond the myths, a tangible culture also began to grow during this time. Archaeological finds from the Longshan and Yangshao cultures, dated to the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, show early forms of ceramics, irrigation systems, and fortified settlements. These were not accidental products, but expressions of a society that was beginning to organize itself and form hierarchies. In this phase, the first stories probably emerged that were later condensed into the myth of the Yellow Emperor. In comparison, one recognizes parallels in Europe with figures such as Romulus or Theseus. There, too, tribal leaders and mythical heroes merged into symbols of a common identity. While the Romans traced their descent to Aeneas, who fled from Troy, the Chinese referred to Huangdi, the wise ruler who brought order and civilization. In both cases, the historical proof was less important than the stories that brought communities together. Especially fascinating is the way the myth was repeatedly reinterpreted over the centuries. During the Han Dynasty, which placed great value on tradition and legitimacy, the Yellow Emperor was celebrated as an ancestral figure of the entire Chinese people. In later eras, he was also used by nationalists as a symbol to emphasize unity in the midst of great cultural diversity. Thus, he experienced a comeback in the 19th century, when China was confronted with Western powers. This time he was regarded not only as a mythical figure, but also as proof of the ancient and proud origin of the Chinese. Yet reality was far more complex. Ethnic diversity, constant migrations, and regional differences shaped the country into a colorful melting pot. The Yellow Emperor, therefore, symbolized less a historical person, and much more the idea of a common origin despite all differences. His legend served as a narrative that promoted integration. Archaeologists point out that, although there is no direct evidence for Huangdi as a historical person, there are indications of the development of several cultural centers along the Huanghe. There, different traditions, techniques, and languages merged into a network that formed the basis of later civilizations. The Yellow Emperor, therefore, stands for a fusion, not for a single bloodline. Exactly, in this tension between myth and reality lies the fascination. He reminds us that nations are not formed only by borders and governments, but also by the stories that people share with one another and believe in. Without these legends, the emotional bond that holds a people together is missing. The trail of the Yellow Emperor thus leads us to the next question. If the origins lie in myths and diverse cultures, how did scholars and historians explain the concrete emergence of the Han? To explore these complex theories, we devote ourselves in the next chapter to the different models of the origin of the Han Chinese. Chapter 10. 4 Theories on the Origin of the Han. The question of the origins of the Han is like a mirror that constantly reveals new facets. What is today considered the largest ethnic group in the world, with more than 1 billion people, did not arise from a single tribe, but from a long process of encounters, migrations, and fusions. Historians, archaeologists, and geneticists have developed different models to explain this development. At the center are 4 theories, each with its own emphasis, giving us insight into the complex ethnogenesis of the Middle Kingdom. The first theory speaks of an autochthonous origin. According to this approach, the ancestors of the Han had already lived since ancient times in the fertile plains of the Huanghe. In the lowest landscapes of northern China, they developed agriculture, ceramics, and early social structures. Finds from the Yongshao and Longshan cultures, dated to the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, are often used as evidence. This view emphasizes continuity. According to it, the Han are essentially descendants of those early settlers who never left their homeland. This gives the people a deep rootedness in the landscape of the Yellow River. The second theory focuses more strongly on migration. The assumption is that the region of China was by no means isolated, but was repeatedly settled by different tribes from the north, west, and south. Some scholars point to connections with the steppe peoples of Mongolia, while others recognize influences from Southeast Asia. Archaeological discoveries, such as bronze objects and grave goods, indicate that cultural interactions took place that can only be explained through migratory movements. This theory emphasizes dynamism. According to it, the Han would be the result of numerous waves of immigration that merged over the centuries. A third perspective combines both approaches. It assumes that a settled population lived in the Huanghe region and developed its culture further, while at the same time, new peoples continued to arrive through trade, marriage alliances, or military expansions. Consequently, the Han cannot be traced back to a single origin, but are the product of constant assimilation. This approach explains why Chinese culture has a central core, but still preserves many regional characteristics. To this day, dialects, eating habits, and traditions differ clearly between north and south, between coast and inland. The fourth theory goes one step further and views China as a node in a much wider migration network. According to this view, the Han were originally part of migratory movements that came from Central Asia or even the Near East and eventually settled in East Asia. Genetic studies that detect small proportions of haplogroups, such as R or J, support this consideration. Similarities in early languages are also discussed. Here it is emphasized that the Han are not only products of China, but part of a broader Eurasian history. All four models do not necessarily contradict one another, but complement one another. There is probably a spark of truth in each theory. One thing is certain, however, for thousands of years, China was a space of intense interactions. Its geographical position between steppes, mountains, seas, and river valleys made it an intersection where cultures met and merged. Exactly there lies the strength of Han identity. It is not a rigid structure, but a fabric made of many threads. If one compares this process with Europe, it recalls the emergence of the Franks, or Slavs, who also arose from smaller groups and formed a shared identity over centuries. In contrast to Europe, however, the development in China took place within a relatively stable political framework that aimed early at a unified empire. This diversity of explanations makes clear that the Han are not simply given, but are the result of a long and complex history. They are the child of myth and migration, of continuity and change at the same time. And exactly this ambivalence leads us to the next chapter. For if the Han emerged from a fabric of peoples, then it is worth looking at the other groups that existed beside them. Peoples such as the Xiongnu, the Xianbei, the Aitan, and the Jurchen, who at times ruled parts of China and left their traces in history. Chapter 11. Peoples in the Empire. Xiongnu, Xianbei, Khitan, Jurchen. The history of China is not only the story of the Han, but also that of their neighbors, opponents, and co-creators. Again and again, different peoples entered the scene, living at the borders, waging wars, forming alliances, or at times even taking control of the empire. 4 of them deserve special mention: the Xiongnu, the Xianbei, the Khitan, and the Jurchen. They show how, through conflict and exchange, the fascinating mosaic of China was expanded and formed. The Xiongnu appeared as early as the 3rd century BC as a powerful confederation of nomads who lived in the steppes north of the Huanghe. For the emperors of the Han dynasty, they were a serious threat, whose cavalry forces carried out lightning-fast attacks. To protect themselves, people began building the fortifications that later grew into the impressive Great Wall. Yet not all relations were hostile. There were also marriage alliances, trade agreements, and phases of relative peace. In a certain sense, the Xiongnu embodied China's eternal dilemma, the striving for security against the steppe, and, at the same time, dependence on it, especially when it came to horses, livestock, or military strategies. In the 4th century AD, the Xianbei then appeared on the scene. They too came from the northern steppes, but differed culturally from the Xiongnu. From loose tribal associations, they founded their own kingdoms in northern China, including the Northern Wei dynasty. Especially fascinating is their influence on Sinicization. Many Xianbei adopted Chinese characters, Confucian rituals, and administrative systems, so that their rule was perceived not as a foreign body, but as part of the Chinese state system. Their history shows how integration can arise from conflict, a process that stabilized the empire in the long term. The Khitan, another mounted people from Manchuria, founded the Liao dynasty in the 10th century. They ruled a vast territory in northern and northeastern China and forced the Song dynasty in the south to pay tribute. Their rule was a balancing act between tradition and adaptation. On the one hand, they held on to their own customs and language. On the other hand, they adopted many Chinese elements in order to organize their empire. It is remarkable that the name Khitai is still used in many languages today as a designation for China, a sign of how lasting their influence on neighboring peoples was. Even more important for later history were the Jurchen. In the 12th century, they founded the Jin dynasty, which controlled large parts of northern China and pushed the Song dynasty southward. They too combined their own nomadic traditions with Chinese structures. Their feared cavalry army earned respect, while internally they relied on an administration modeled on Confucian principles. Later, the descendants of the Jurchen, the Manchu, would found the last great dynasty of China, the Qing, which ruled from the 17th into the early 20th century. This finally made clear that not only the Han, but also other peoples shaped the face of China. When one looks at these four groups, a clear pattern emerges. At first, they stand as opponents at the border. Later, they themselves take power in the empire. And finally, they partly merge with the majority culture. This cycle of conflict and integration is unique in its continuity. Europe was for a long time shaped by conflicts between clearly defined nations, while China possessed the remarkable ability to integrate foreign rulers and incorporate them into its own system. The stories of the Xiongnu, Xianbei, Khitan, and Jurchen make clear that China was always a multi-ethnic state whose strength came precisely from this diversity. But the land was shaped not only by external influences, internal developments also played a decisive role. Especially in the 19th century, it became clear that the traditional worldview of the Middle Kingdom collided with the emerging reality of nation-states. In the next chapter, we will therefore examine how China carried out the transformation from a civilization to a young nation, an upheaval that deeply shook the self-understanding of the empire. Chapter 12. Nation or civilization. China in the 19th century. Until far into the 19th century, China did not see itself as a nation in the European sense, but as a superior civilization standing above all others. In its self-understanding, the Middle Kingdom was the only legitimate center of the world order, while the remaining states existed merely as peripheral regions that had to pay tribute. Yet, over the course of the century, this self-image fell into an existential crisis, a confrontation between the old order and the new world that would fundamentally change China. The first shock came with the Opium Wars. When British gunboats appeared off the coasts in the 1840s, it became clear that the old superiority was no longer enough. The capture of coastal cities, the forced Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, and the opening of ports to Western powers marked the end of the old tribute order. For the first time, China had to recognize that there were militarily superior powers. Even more serious was the humiliation in the Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860, when British and French troops entered Beijing and forced the imperial court to recognize their demands. For an empire that saw itself as the center of the cosmos, this was an unprecedented loss of face. The idea of an eternal civilization superior to others was shaken to its foundations. Yet, it was not only the West that brought this shock. Within Asia, too, the balance of power changed. Especially the defeat in the war against Japan between 1894 and 1895 struck China at the heart. Japan, long viewed as a younger brother, had proven itself to be a modern nation-state that had successfully adopted the Western model. The fact that a neighbor that had once been part of the Chinese cultural sphere now appeared as an equal and defeated the Middle Kingdom was felt as a deep humiliation and made the urgency of change clear. In this situation, the search for a new self-understanding began. Intellectuals such as Liang Qichao turned to a concept that had previously received little attention in Chinese thought: the nation. Inspired by European theories, he argued that the Chinese had to understand themselves as a people with a shared history and identity. But what name should this people carry? Various dynastic designations were available, but ultimately Han prevailed. Not only did the long rule of the Han Dynasty shape the memory of that period, but it was also perceived as a golden age. Thus, the fundamental transformation began. From a civilization characterized by cosmic order and cultural superiority, China slowly developed into a nation that had to survive within the community of modern states. This transition was painful and marked by internal conflicts. While the elites tried to form a national identity, the empire remained, in its structure, a multi-ethnic state. Tibetans, Uyghurs, Manchu, and Mongols belonged to the empire. Yet the newly emerging national feeling focused above all on the Han. Compared with Europe, a striking difference becomes visible here. There, nations often emerged from the collapse of large empires. In China, however, the path toward nationhood meant a break with a civilization idea that was thousands of years old. The European nation was a product of modernity, while the Chinese nation relied on a past that reached beyond the concept of the nation. This tension between civilization and nations still has effects today and shapes Chinese identity, which refers both to ancient traditions and to the structures of the modern state. Here, a fascinating aspect of explanation opens up. If we examine the changes in identity, we should also focus on the biological dimension. In recent decades, geneticists have tried, through DNA analyses, to research the origins of the Han and their connections to other peoples. In the next chapter, we therefore turn to the interesting question of what genetics reveals about the diversity, half, and history of the Chinese people. Chapter 13. Genes and DNA. Diversity within the Han people. When we speak about the history of a people, we often think of dynasties, wars, or cultural achievements. Yet, in recent years, geneticists have found an additional key to illuminating the past: the genetic material. DNA analyses can make migration movements visible, reveal kinship relationships, and preserve memories of encounters that have long faded from historical documents. Among the Han as well, genetic studies provide fascinating insights that enrich the picture of ethnogenesis. Studies show that the majority of Han belong to haplogroup O, which is widespread in East Asia. Especially common are lines such as O3, followed by O2 and O1. These lines point to a shared root deeply anchored in the prehistory of East Asia. They reflect the continuity that is also visible in archaeological finds along the Yellow River. One could say that they form the genetic core that has supported the foundation of Han identity for thousands of years. Yet genetics tells not only of stability, but also of diversity. Alongside the dominant haplogroup O, there are also shares of other lines that point to historical contacts. Thus, group C2 can be detected, which is closely connected with the Mongolic steppe peoples. Its presence shows that over the centuries there were not only conflicts, but also mixtures. Something similar applies to N1, a line that also occurs among peoples in northern Eurasia. The appearance of such genetic traces in the Han gene pool casts a fascinating light on the far-reaching migrations of our ancestors. Especially interesting are the smaller but remarkable proportions of haplogroups such as G and J, which have their origins in the Near East or the Caucasus. In China, they are represented only in very small quantities, yet their presence points to long trade and migration routes that led through Central Asia. Through the Silk Road as a connecting corridor, not only goods but also people reached the East. The fact that we still find these traces today in the genetic material of the Han makes clear how strongly globalization was already active in antiquity. Another exciting aspect concerns haplogroup R, which is mainly associated with populations in southern Siberia and Europe. In the Taklamakan Desert, mummies have been discovered that were buried thousands of years ago and carried haplogroup R1A. This points to connections that reach far beyond the Asian space. The fact that small shares of this group are still preserved in the Han gene pool shows how early China was part of a larger Eurasian network. Compared with the genetic diversity of Europe, it becomes clear that there too the genetic landscape was shaped by mixing. Haplogroups such as R1b, I, or J show the traces of migration from Anatolia, the Near East, or the steppes. Both China and share the fact that their populations do not come from a single source, but are the result of complex migrations. The decisive difference, however, lies in the fact that in China, a written culture accompanied these developments for thousands of years, while in Europe genetics often closes gaps in the written tradition. DNA confirms what history already suggests. The Han are not the result of a straight-line development, but rather the product of a long series of encounters. They were shaped by settled farmers along the Yellow River, by mounted peoples from the steppe, by traders from Central Asia, and by contacts reaching as far as the Near East. Precisely, this mixture explains the great adaptability that made the people strong over thousands of years. Yet genetics alone is not enough to grasp the complete picture. It is a tool that reads traces, but it needs to be complemented by language, myths, and culture. Here, the view opens onto an even greater question. How can we bring all these strands, myths, migrations, and genes together in order to understand the identity of the Han? The answer is found in the concluding chapter, which shows how a modern nation emerged from an ancient empire and a long civilization. Chapter 14. Conclusion. An old empire, a young nation. When we look back on the long journey through the history of China, we see a mosaic made of myths, power struggles, discoveries, and encounters. No other country connects such a deeply rooted past with such a young national identity. Since the 3rd millennium BC, cultures have flourished in the fertile plain of the Huanghe, laying the foundation for a civilization with ceramics, bronze, and writing. From these cultures emerged dynasties that shaped rule, administration, and worldviews. Yet the modern concept of a nation, as we understand it today, formed only in the 19th century. Over the course of that century, while Europe had already formed nation-states and Japan modernized with impressive speed, a fascinating field of tension unfolded, one that gives China its uniqueness. Here, one of the oldest civilizations in the world meets a nation that defined itself only relatively late. The apparent contradiction quickly reveals itself as a strength. China's ability to assimilate different elements, reshape them, and bring them into a harmonious unity. Peoples such as the Xiongnu, the Khitan, and the Jurchen were not only rivals, but also became part of the rich history. Dynasties such as the Yuan and Qing, led by Mongols and Manchu, left lasting traces just as the Han did. This diversity created a continuity that was not based on homogeneity, but on the art of integration. Genetics also reflects this picture. The core of Han identity is deeply rooted in the East, yet migration traces from the steppe, Central Asia, and even the Near East testify to the openness of this empire over the centuries. Just as the written characters preserved cultural unity over thousands of years, so too did the mixing of genes form a diversity that became one of China's strengths. China, therefore, does not embody the story of an isolated people, but the story of a space in which cultures constantly collide with one another. Compared with Europe, both differences and parallels become visible. While nations there often emerged from the collapse of larger empires, China had to take the opposite path. From a civilization that understood itself as the center of the world, it became a nation that had to assert itself in an environment of many equal states. This transition was painful. Marked by defeats and humiliations in the 19th century, it nevertheless also led to a new self-confidence that unites tradition and modernity. The conclusion of this moving journey is clear. China is an old empire with a young nation. History teaches us that identity is dynamic and constantly changes in dialogue with the past, in conflict with the foreign, and in adaptation to new circumstances. Precisely in this power of transformation lies the special fascination. When we look at China today, we see not only a present world power, but also the echo of a civilization that has existed for thousands of years. The myths of the Yellow Emperor, the inventions of paper and the compass, the voyages of Zheng, and the struggles against external threats live on in the consciousness of a people that knows its roots and, at the same time, looks toward the future. Perhaps there is a message in this for all of us. History is never finished. It is a river that carries and shapes us. China reminds us that even the oldest cultures can reinvent themselves when the time demands it. An old empire, a young nation, both in one. And exactly in this lies the fascination of this land. I would now like to ask you, which episode touched you the most? Was it the legend of the Yellow Emperor, the adventures of Zheng, or the emergence of the Han Nation in the 19th century? Share your thoughts in the comments. I am excited to hear your perspective. Did you enjoy this journey? Then do not forget to subscribe to our channel so that you do not miss any future stories. Share this video with friends who are also interested in history, and let us continue going on journeys of discovery together. Because history knows no end.